Chapter 5 of Lucy Gayheart by Willa Cather. I'm recording this in the middle of the night, so there won't be as much noise from the train going by on the Manhattan Bridge. Here we go. Chapter 5. The recital this evening was given in a small hall before an audience made up of Germans and Jews. Lucy arrived very early and was able to change her seat, which was near our box, for one in the back of the house, in the shadow of a pillar, where she could feel very much alone. She had never heard Die Winterweise sung straight through as an integral work. For her, it was being sung for the first time, something newly created, and she attributed to the artist much that belonged to the composer. She kept feeling that this was not an interpretation. This was the thing itself, with one man and one nature behind every song. The singing was not dramatic, in any way she knew. Sebastian did not identify himself with this melancholy youth. He presented him as if he were a memory, not to be brought too near into the present. One felt a long distance between the singer and the scenes he was recalling, a long perspective. This evening, Lucy tried to give some attention to the accompanist. There was good reason, surely, if she were to attempt to take his place tomorrow. Even at the other concerts, she had felt that she had never heard anyone play the voice so well. Der Krohe, der Wegweiser. There was something uncanny in that young man's short, insinuating fingers. She admired him, but she didn't like him. Was she jealous already? No. Something in his physical personality set her on edge a little. He was picturesque, too picturesque. He had this very white skin that sometimes goes with red hair, and tonight, as he sat against an olive green velvet curtain, his features seemed to disappear altogether. His face looked like a handful of flour thrown against the velvet. His head was rather flat behind the ears, and his red hair seemed to clasp it in a wreath of curls that were stiff, but not tight. She thought she remembered plaster casts in the art museum with just such curls. For some reason, she didn't like the way he moved across the stage. His lameness gave him a weak, undulating walk, like a rag walking, she thought. It was contemptible to hold a man's infirmity against him. Besides, if this young man weren't lame, she would not be going to Sebastian's studio tomorrow. She would never have met him at all. How strange it was that James Mockford's bad hip should bring about the most important thing that had ever happened to her. After the concert, Paul Auerbach, in his old-fashioned dress coat and white lawn tie, came up to her. "I was going back to the artist's room, Lucy. Would you like to go with me?" She hesitated. No, thank you, Mr. Auerbach. I'd rather not. Will he really expect me tomorrow, do you think? That's the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The next morning, Lucy was walking across the city toward Michigan Avenue. She was happy. She was frightened, couldn't keep her attention on anything. Her mind had gone away from her and was darting about in the sunlight, over the tops of the tall buildings. Exactly at 10 o'clock, she went into the arts building and told the hall porter she had an engagement with Mr. Sebastian. He rang for the elevator, and she was taken up to the 6th story. When she lifted the brass knocker, Sebastian himself opened the door. "I was expecting you," he said with a nod. "I knew you were in town, for I saw you in my audience last night, hiding behind a pillar. Did you like the concert?" He took her coat from her and hung it up. "Better take off your hat, too. You'll be more comfortable." The music room opened directly off the entry hall, with only a doorway between. As she walked into it, Lucy noticed it was a big room full of sunlight, and that the general color was dark red. The rugs and curtains and chairs, The piano stood at the front, between two windows. Sebastian saw that she was not looking at anything. Probably she was frightened again. "Shall we begin? We can talk afterwards. We'll work a little on the Elijah. I have to go to St. Paul to sing it with an oratorio society very soon, and I've not looked at it for a long while." When she sat down at the piano, he put the music on the rack, turning over the pages. "Before we begin with my part, we might just run through the tenor's aria here. It's much too high for me, of course, but I like to sing it." He pointed to the page and began, "If with all your heart you truly seek him." That's a nice introduction to the whole thing, isn't it? Now, we'll take it up just here. He leaned over and indicated with his finger. He walked up and down in his elkskin shoes as he sang, his hands in the pockets of his smoking jacket. Lucy had no thought for anything but the score in front of her. An hour and a half went by very quickly. Just when she thought things were going better, he put his hand on her shoulder. "Enough for today, Miss Gayheart. Very good for a first trial. Shall we begin at the same hour tomorrow? And don't become agitated when you make mistakes. What I most want is elasticity. You must learn to catch a hint quickly in the tempi. When I'm eccentric, catch step with me. I have a reason, or I think I have. Now, suppose we sit down over here by the fire and have a glass of port and a biscuit. We've worked very hard." She rose and went to the chair he pointed out. She suddenly felt tired. Sebastian lowered the heavy window shades a little until the sunshine fell only on the rugs and the brass fire irons. He brought a tray with a decanter and glasses and sat down opposite her, lounging back in his chair with his feet to the fire. "Have you ever heard the Elijah well given, Miss Gayheart?" Lucy told him she'd never heard it given at all. He smiled indulgently. "Mendelssohn is out of fashion right now." "Who is the fashion?" "Debussy, of course. You've noticed that people are interested in music chiefly to have something to talk about at dinner parties." Lucy murmured she couldn't say to that. She didn't go to dinner parties, and she didn't know anyone in Chicago except Professor Auerbach and a few of his students. "And in your own part of the country, isn't it so?" "I think my father is the only person in our town who is much interested in music. He leads the town band and gives lessons on the clarinet." "Your father is a music teacher?" "Not exactly. He's a watchmaker by trade. But he plays the clarinet and flute very well, and the violin a little." "German, of course?" "That's good. A German watchmaker who plays the flute seems to me a comfortable sort of father to have." He asked her how she happened to come to Chicago and to study with Auerbach. She felt that his questions were not perfunctory, that he really wanted to know something about her life, and she got over her shyness. While they were talking, the outer door opened softly, and a little man in a stiffly starched white jacket and noiseless tennis shoes, carrying several coats on hangers, darted through the room and disappeared into the sleeping chamber beyond. "That is Giuseppe, my valet," Sebastian explained. "Come in and see how well he does for me." He opened the door and took Lucy into his sleeping room. "Giuseppe, this is the Signorina who is coming to play for me until Mr. Mockford is better. I want her to see how we live." "Si, signore." Giuseppe smiled eagerly and stepped back from the clothes closet, pointing to the rows of coats and trousers, very much as if he were a guide in a picture gallery. When he thought she had observed them sufficiently, he flourished his hand toward the dressing table and toward a bed of faultless contour. "Yes, he keeps everything very neat. If you went through my bureau drawers, you'd find them just like your own. He makes my breakfast, too, and brings it up to me." Giuseppe stood holding his hands clasped in front of his stomach, smiling like a little boy being praised. His face seemed almost like a boy's, but his hair, Lucy noticed, was thin and faded, and his high red forehead, shaped like a bowl, was seamed by deep lines from left to right. A moment later, when he had gone to the far end of the music room to put fresh coal on the fire, Lucy asked Sebastian whether Giuseppe had been with him long. "I picked him up in London on the way over. He used to be valet de chambre in a hotel in Florence. I've never had better service. Think of it. He has got all those lines on his forehead worrying about other people's coats and boots and breakfasts. I haven't a friend in the world who would do for me what this little man would." Something in the way he said this made Lucy feel a trifle downcast. She almost wished that she was Giuseppe. After all, it was people like that who counted with artists more than their admirers. When she left the studio a few moments later, she found the Italian in the little entrance hall before a table drawer which was divided into compartments. Into these he was putting away gloves. Into one, white gloves. Into another, tan. Into another, gray. A man must be rich and successful indeed to live in such beautiful order, she thought. When she reached her own room after lunch, she looked about it with affection and compassion. She pulled down the shades, opened the window a little, and threw herself upon the bed, too tired to sit up and too much excited to sleep. Things she had scarcely noticed at the time came rushing through her mind. The dressing gown thrown on a chair, the silver on the dressing table, the spongy softness of the rose-colored blankets the valet was smoothing on the bed, and those gloves in the table drawer. Evidently, nothing ever came near Sebastian to tarnish his personal elegance. She had never known a man who lived like that. Harry Gordon was rich, to be sure. He owned carriages and blooded horses, sleighs and guns, and he had his clothes made in Chicago. But his things stood out and weren't a part of himself. His overcoats were harsh to touch. His hats were stiff. He was crude like everyone else she knew. An upstanding young man, they called him at home, easy and masterful in his own town. But in a big city, he took on a certain self-importance, as if he were afraid of being ignored in the crowd. She remembered just how Sebastian looked when he stood against the light, in his heelless shoes and old velvet jacket. He would be equal to any situation in the world. He had a simplicity that must come from having lived a great deal and mastered a great deal. If you brushed against his life ever so slightly, it was like tapping on a deep bell. You felt all you could not hear.